Sean Ono Lennon turned 35 on October 9th, 2011. He shares the same birthday with his father, who would have turned 70. I met Sean when he was a week old. His parents invited me to New York to see him. We have known each other for his entire life and more than half of mine. For a myriad of reasons, he is one of the best people I have ever known. We have spent thousands of hours together, and I know that I have learned more from him than he could possibly have picked up from me. I have watched him grow, from child to man. I marvel at his brilliance, his musicianship, the uniqueness of his relationship with his mother, his uncanny sense of humor, highly personal style, but mostly his sense of loyalty. We have been together through the best and worst of times, and have never once had an argument. Sometimes I think of Sean as the son I never had, or the brother I always wished for. But our enduring friendship dwarfs those fleeting thoughts. Sean has been a guest at my home on hundreds of occasions, and one night, in November of 2010, he visited, accompanied by his girlfriend and fellow musician, Charlotte. They have a band called Ghost of a Saber-Toothed Tiger. As is the case with all of these at-home visits, there was no agenda or pretense of a formal interview. Can you recall the first poem that you memorized?
That's an interesting question. I did have to memorize poems when I was in school in Switzerland. And if I can recall the poem that I memorized, I don't think I can recall the poem. It's really hard to say. I think it was a poem by E. E. Cummings. I remember. It was the one about not even the rain has such small hands. Do you remember that one?
I vaguely recall it.
Yeah, and I remember that it was kind of revolutionary because, you know, E. Cummings used all the points and semicolons and commas and stuff, and he didn't capitalize very much.
Was he the first poet that used the space on the page as an art form in terms of where the lines would be? And
Yeah, I think he was. I think a lot of people use him as an example of an archetype of sort of pretentious postmodern poetry because, you know, he has those poems that sort of, you know, make a shape of the subject of the poem visually. But if you think about it, Lewis Carroll did that, didn't he? In Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. He did things like that.
I'm going to take a look. I don't...
You actually have it in your...
I have it in the library.
Collection. Yeah, but I really wasn't that into poetry when I was a kid. I was really only interested in things that made me interesting to the opposite sex. And so I felt that poetry was kind of sissy, like ballet or piano, which wasn't really cool when I was growing up in the 80s. Whereas now I think if you play piano or if you do ballet and you're a young boy in school, you might be considered to be interesting. Whereas in my day, you would get beaten up for doing that kind of thing. So I do really regret putting the tutu aside and taking up rock and roll blues guitar as I did. But those are the choices that we make, and we have to live by them.
Presumably your tutu is not all that far away.
Well, it's never very far. I keep it near in my heart, but sadly, it doesn't really fit anymore.
You can always get a larger one to accommodate the new consciousness.
But I do regret not studying poetry because I do write songs, and part of songwriting is the lyrics. And I do feel that although I'm able to write lyrics, it doesn't come as naturally as the music does. And I really think that's just a result of not having practiced that part of my brain, exercised that part of my brain. Whereas Charlotte, my girlfriend, with whom I have the band, The Ghost of a Saber-Toothed Tiger, whose album came out in October.
That's The Ghost of a Saber-Toothed Tiger.
Or in French, that's Le Tigre à dents de sabre. No, Le Fantôme d'un Tigre à dents de sabre.
That speaks for itself.
And she's quite gifted with words, and she can sort of write lyrics very quickly. So to every 7 lines she writes, I write 1. But that doesn't mean I don't write them, it just comes slower. And I think that's a result of not having taken poetry more seriously. But in the 80s, again, growing up in New York on the streets of the Upper West Side, as I did, one wasn't allowed to have feelings if you were a boy. We were encouraged to do things like javelin and fencing and rapping. We used to have a lot of rap-offs, freestyle rap competitions, and windmill competitions, breakdancing on cardboard. And that's really where I come from.
So one could perceive of your cultural roots as being more Upper West Side street, rapping, dancing.
I'm a dancer and I'm a lover. And I used to be in a hip-hop breakdancing crew called Kids in Control, and it was apostrophe N. And later there was a band called In Sync, who actually, I think, borrowed from us, from our nomenclatorial tendencies, and our clitorial tendencies. They took our name and they took our style, which I don't really mind because I think you were saying earlier that in the modern world, too many things are copyrighted. So I don't think you can own something like that, own a style, as it were. And I relinquish the in of Kids in Control to In Sync gladly, without any regret.
Do you take any pleasure in the thought that you may have been one of the inspirational voices for In Sync as a band?
I mean, I try not to take that kind of pleasure as often as I used to because my doctor advised me against it. But sometimes when the moon is just right, I can sit alone with a bottle of wine and some Kleenex and some coconut oil and basically have a little party.
If just perchance a member or a former member of In Sync might be viewing this, is there anything that you would like to say or address or communicate?
What are their names again?
You can just discuss them in an aggregate.
Yeah. Where are my socks? I think you know.